Is speaking in tongues a spiritual gift or a Christian curse word? Will I go to hell if I fake it? Let's talk about none of these things and more on You Can't Say That in Church. Welcome to You Can't Say That in Church, a video podcast where we talk about all of the awkward things. I'm Chandrese and I'll be your host for the next few minutes. Each episode, we focus on a topic that is often avoided in the church and we chew on it until it is easier to swallow. Today's word that shall not be said is tongues, specifically speaking in tongues. Why do modern day Christians avoid the practice of speaking in tongues? I actually don't think that it is a failing on the part of modern Christians. And when I say modern Christians, I'm talking about young Christians. I think young Christians oftentimes get this rap for being watered down or lacking in faith. But I don't think that that's always true. It can be true, but it's not always the case, especially when it comes to this topic of speaking in tongues. I think that speaking in tongues is an area that is not often explained deeply enough to new Christians, and as a result they don't understand it, and so it becomes a cycle. You don't understand it, and then you get into a situation where you feel pressured as if you need to speak in tongues, or you need to understand someone else speaking in tongues, or someone else should understand you speaking in tongues in order to show that you are actually Christian. And so maybe you fake it, and then you have this moment of feeling disingenuous. You start to really question your faith, and then you decide, okay, I'm so confused about this topic that I'm just going to avoid it, and it just becomes a cycle of not talking about speaking in tongues. And so we want to address that today. So let's break it down. Acts chapter 2 verse 4 is the verse that people will often refer to when they're learning or teaching about the practice of speaking in tongues. But this is a big mistake because Acts chapter 2 verse 4 is actually about the day of Pentecost, and it's about the gift of prophecy. Now you may be thinking to yourself, Chandrese, that's not true. I can go to Acts chapter 2 verse 4 right now and it will say they are speaking in tongues. And that's true. They are speaking in tongues. But if you go further on in the passage, it says that the reason that they're able to hear each other and understand one another as if they are speaking in the same dialect is because they are practicing the gift of prophecy. I'm going to read all these things to you so that you don't think that I made this up myself. In Acts chapter 2 verse 4, it says, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. I know it says that, but I'm going to go down to Acts chapter 2 verse 14. It says, then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. Sorry, that gets me every time. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days and they will prophesy. And so Peter never mentions the gift of speaking in tongues. Although speaking in tongues is what was happening, it's not the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues that's later talked about by Paul. Okay, now you might be thinking, okay, my whole life is a lie. No, it's not a lie. If you go to 1 Corinthians 14, Paul very explicitly describes the difference between the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues and the spiritual gift of prophecy. He says that speaking in tongues is a wordless babbling that you do with God. The Holy Spirit within you speaks to God directly by your speaking in tongues. It is not something that anybody else can understand. He says it is unintelligible by others. So what happened in Acts chapter 2, verse 4 on the day of Pentecost cannot be the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. Otherwise, the Bible is a lie. Paul's a liar. Peter's a liar. One of them's a liar. I'm not sure which one. Probably Peter because he's ratchet. But we're going to assume that both of them are right and that what happened on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 verse 4 was actually prophecy, but you still have the ability to speak in tongues as a spiritual gift. So what does this mean for you? This means that if you speak in tongues and you can't understand anything that anyone else is saying and nobody else can understand you, but you are having a free conversation with God through the Holy Spirit, then you are speaking in tongues. Nobody else can tell you any different. Nobody else can take that away from you. It does not define your Christianity if you cannot understand someone else who is speaking in tongues. I want to encourage you, because this is the way that we build a relationship with God. It's through allowing our Holy Spirit to pray on our behalf and wordless moaning towards God so that He is able to build a relationship with us. But we want to hear what you think. This is a video podcast and we love your engagement. If you're listening solely on the podcast, you can go over to YouTube and you can check out our channel. You can go directly to this podcast and type your responses in the comments. We do want to encourage you to be nice. If you disagree, you can totally disagree. We welcome disagreements, but we also welcome kindness. We welcome caring when we're having conversations with one another, and we speak in love. Thank you for joining us for this video podcast. Stay chewy.